welcome to the actual news, where we cover the stories that actually matter and nobody is safe. In the week's headlines, Nigerians under 40 can no longer visit the United Arab Emirates. Nigerians and Diaspora Commission Chair Abike Dabiri has accused yours truly of committing murder. And the federal government has suspended the Eastern Railway Corridor project. More on this. We start in Abuja, where on August 25, Nigerians and Diaspora Commission Chair Abike Dabiri Erewa, during a press conference she held concerning the circumstances around the death of Itunu Babalola, the wrongfully jailed Nigerian woman who died in prison in November 2021 in Cote d'Ivoire, she accused me of being involved in the death of Itunu. Now, it will be recalled that Itunu Babalola's story came to the fore of national consciousness in March 2021 when I put the story out. I put it out on my Twitter handle to begin with, and then in August 2021, I wrote a comprehensive investigative article about it, which involved me actually traveling to Cote d'Ivoire to gather some, on-ground intelligence, or at least that was the plan at the time. Shortly after the story initially came to the fore in March 2021, the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Nigerians and Diaspora Commission made all the right noises. They said we're going to look into it, we're mobilizing assets and resources to ensure that this lady whose case was open and shut was going to be freed from prison. Whereas the Ivorians had basically told her that she was going to die there. And then 8 months passed, and that is exactly what happened. She died there. Shortly after she died, you might recall also last year, Abike Dabiri then embarked on a nationwide media tour to essentially state that it was not her fault. It was everybody else's fault, but not hers. And in the course of that press tour, she accused me at the time of using Itunu's death to make money for myself. What had happened at the time was I had tweeted Itunu's father's bank details. I was doing a fundraiser for him using his own bank details, because the Nigerian embassy in Cote d'Ivoire was trying to extort him. They were saying that unless he pays some money, they're not going to be able to transport his daughter's corpse home. And I said, look, let's sort this guy out. Let's cut the Nigerian government out of this. They've already failed her. She's already dead. At least let this guy bury his daughter in peace. And then she accused me of trying to use the opportunity to make money for myself. That was bad enough. Apparently, there is no depth that a public official who is paid by my taxes as a Nigerian will not stoop to. On August 25, I got several notifications. People were saying, have you read the story on the cable? And I opened the story, and in this story, Abike Dabiri basically all but mentioned my name. She didn't mention my name, but she described me in quite some detail. She said that there was a Nigerian who visited Itunu in jail, that this person, this man, this male, dark-skinned Nigerian was someone who claimed that he had been investigating the story, who had been going around saying that he's investigating the story. As far as I know, there's only one journalist in Nigeria who investigated the story, and that's the person talking right now. She said that this person visited Itunu shortly before she died, and this person had a relationship with Itunu, and that this person was somehow involved in Itunu's death. And no, I'm not making this up. This is actually what she said.
2019년 새해가 왔습니다. 새해를 맞이하는 이 시각 우리 인민은 위대한 당의 용도 따라 높은 민족적 자존심을 안고 모든 것을 우리식대로 창조하고 발전시키며 광명한 미래를 앞당겨온 지난해를 금기 높이 돌이켜보고 있습니다. 조선민주주의인민공화국 창건 70돌을 승리자의 대정치 축전으로 성대히 경축한 지난해 2018년은 경애하는 최고 용도자 김정은 동지의 탁출한 용도력이
You see, these are the things that you see that make you understand that there are a lot of people who are in public service in Nigeria who have no business being there, and that there are also a lot of people who have built careers and reputations off of things that did not exist. In Abike Dabri's case, for example, she supposedly built a public-facing career as some sort of journalist, some journalist of some description back when she was a newsreader at a government-owned TV station, the Nigeria Television Authority, NTA. And based off of that fake sort of non-reputation, she has managed to build an entire political career and career in public service built on absolutely nothing, a reputation which is built on nothing. And these are the instances where you get a peek behind the curtain and you get to see exactly what sort of human beings we have in public service in Nigeria. I'm not going to bother doing a defense of myself because I think that's insulting. And I think it's insulting to the memory of Itunu to have to sit here and say that I, who spend my personal resources, has used 8 months of my time as best I could to try to get her out of a situation that she had no business being in, was somehow involved in her death. And even more insultingly, that I had a relationship with her. Clearly, Abike Dabiri isn't somebody who places much of a premium on the concept of having a conscience, and that's fine. That's not really what I'm here to talk about. But the point here is, apparently, in the year 2022, we're at the point in Nigeria where a journalist who goes over and beyond to try to do his job, this is the thanks he will get. He will get accused of murder, basically. He will have a prominent public servant publicly trying to frame him up in the most ridiculous manner possible for a murder. So, Abike Dabiri, thank you very much. God bless you. You've done really well. Moving on. The federal government has suspended the Eastern Railway Corridor project. Now, as you might recall, a few weeks ago in my Business Day column, I broke the news that this was going to happen. I had received a tip-off from the Ministry of Transport shortly after Rotimi Amechi resigned and the new guy took over that. The new guy, Engineer Sambo, was trying to prioritize the Kano to Maradi railway line, the funding for the Kano to Maradi railway line at the expense of the Port Harcourt to Maiduguri railway line. And the person who gave me the tip actually wanted me to sort of put this out there and sort of make sure that this doesn't happen, that it's marginalization and it's not fair. And I remember saying in my Business Day column that I did no such thing because I was actually happy that this thing was going to be stopped. And now it has actually stopped. And I stand by what I said. It's a good thing that it has stopped. And here's why. Now, for those of you who may not understand the significance of what that rail project was, let's start with a sort of simple, quick explainer of the concept of standard gauge rail and narrow gauge rail. Now, narrow gauge rail is essentially the railway infrastructure that was inherited from the British colonial administration in Nigeria. The exact technical specifics for what constitutes narrow gauge rail varies from place to place, but generally speaking, it's safe to say that narrow gauge rail tops out at about 65 kilometers per hour. That's approximately the top speed that a train running on a narrow gauge line can achieve anywhere on Earth, about 65 kilometers per hour. Standard gauge rail, on the other hand, is the newer standard which supports speeds of up to 180 kilometers per hour. In Nigeria, we have at least two functioning standard gauge railway lines. That's the Abuja to Kaduna rail line and the Lagos to Ibadan rail line. Both of them have design speeds of about 160 kilometers per hour, even though they currently operate at about less than half of that because the tracks have not been fixed. But in theory, they can go up to 180 kilometers per hour. So that's essentially the difference between standard gauge rail and narrow gauge rail. Narrow gauge rail is slow, standard gauge rail is relatively fast. And standard gauge rail also bears heavier loads than narrow gauge rail. Now, why this is significant is that the project in question, the Port Harcourt to Maiduguri railway line, which has just been stopped, was actually a refurbishment of the existing narrow gauge railway. And if you don't understand what the significance of that is, let's steer into that now. Lagos and Ibadan, which are the two major economic centers in the southwest of Nigeria, are now connected by a standard gauge railway line. In theory, what that means on paper is that the southwestern economic corridor of Nigeria is converging, it's getting smaller. it will become more and more possible to exchange goods and cycle through transactions quicker. On paper, that is how to grow an economy. That's how to make an economy bigger and how to grow it at a faster pace. When transactions are able to have a quicker turnaround time, more goods are able to be exchanged in a shorter period of time, more business can be done in the same space of time. That's how an economy grows. So on paper, you can say that the southwestern economic corridor of Nigeria has been set up for economic growth and advancement in the near to medium term. Now, in the Niger Delta and the Southeast, on the other hand, which is the second important economic corridor in Nigeria, statistically, the second most productive part of Nigeria. In fact, if you take out Lagos, then that economic corridor becomes the single most economically active corridor in Nigeria, because obviously Lagos and Abuja are heavily inflated by virtue of being the former and present federal capital cities. Now, in the entirety of the Southeast and the Niger Delta, there is of course no standard gauge rail infrastructure, which means that movement of cargo within that region is extremely slow and is dependent on road infrastructure, which is often unsafe and poorly maintained. So what this means is that essentially the second, or depending on how you calculate it, possibly even the first most important economic corridor in Nigeria has no ability to quicken trade within itself, which essentially means that the potential growth of that region has been stunted by this lack of infrastructure. Now, initially there was a plan for a very ambitious standard gauge rail line that was going to sort of encompass the entirety of the Niger Delta corridor, connect the southeast and onward to the northeast. When the Buhari government came in, it was basically assumed that there was no money to do this, so compromises were going to have to be found. Those compromises did not affect the Lagos-Ibadan railway line, and rightfully so, because Lagos and Ibadan are two hugely economically important cities in Nigeria. So there definitely was an economic justification for investing that amount of money into a standard gauge rail line joining both cities. Now, in the southeastern corridor, however, there were no such considerations. It was decided, funny enough, under Rotimi Amaechi, who himself is from the Niger Delta, from Rivers State no less, from Port Harcourt no less, that instead of putting in the required investment to build a proper standard gauge, modern standard gauge rail line connecting Port Harcourt and the southeast to the northeast or to any other corridor in Nigeria, then instead what was going to happen was that the existing narrow gauge rail infrastructure, which had pretty much collapsed, would be refurbished. Now, there are three reasons why this is not a good idea, to put it very lightly. The first, and in my opinion the most important, is that in a situation where the other regions in Nigeria are being connected within themselves and among themselves via standard gauge railway line. So there's a Kaduna to Abuja standard gauge rail line, which is obviously active. There's the Kano to Maradi railway line, which is under construction. There's the Warri to Itakwe standard gauge line, which is also active, and there's Lagos to Ibadan standard gauge rail line, which is active. There is a possibility that all of these lines someday, depending on economic circumstances, will start to converge. They will start to connect with each other, which obviously, as I explained before, leads to greater economic integration. There's more trade going on, transactions cycle quicker, the economy grows. But the Southeast and the Niger Delta have been deliberately left out of that potential for economic growth. And the reason for that is narrow gauge rail and standard gauge rail do not interoperate. You cannot connect a standard gauge rail line to a narrow gauge rail line. They do not interoperate. So what that means is, if you have a standard gauge rail line going to Itakwe or Asaba or Warri, and you have a narrow gauge rail line also going to that place, when the train wagon coming on the narrow gauge rail terminates at Warri or wherever, you then have to offload everything and then load everything onto a wagon that runs on the standard gauge rail track, which obviously defeats the purpose of rail travel, which is supposed to be efficient and quick, right? So essentially, the decision that was made to reconstruct the existing narrow gauge rail infrastructure instead of upgrading it to standard gauge as was done elsewhere was a decision that was intentionally taken to retard the growth of Nigeria's second most economically important region. So that's one reason. Standard gauge rail and narrow gauge rail do not interoperate. The second reason, which is closely tied to the first, is that in political terms, it's an insult. It's a slap on the face. Because essentially what that says is that where there is no economic justification, there's no business case for the investments in standard gauge rail, such as, for example, Kaduna to Abuja, or more egregiously, Kano to Maradi, where there is no evidence that the economic activity that takes place along that corridor will ever be enough to repay the Chinese loan that will go into building out that rail line. The decision was taken anyway to build it out, right? The thought of there being not enough money was not a factor in making that decision. Because when it comes to Kano and Katsina and Maradi, there must be money, right? Even though those areas are not the areas that the money comes from, they are not the economically productive areas. And that's, argue with the statistics, don't argue with me, right? That's what the numbers say. But there is no money, it was never an issue for them. When it came to the Southwest, obviously there was money, rightfully so. But when it comes to the Southeast and the Niger Delta, all of a sudden, there is no money. And then they have to make do with something which is not just going to alienate them from the rest of the country in the future. It's also something which is going to be extremely tedious and difficult to maintain. And this ties into my third point, that narrow gauge rail infrastructure has basically been phased out pretty much everywhere on earth, except maybe some parts of India and South Africa. So essentially, and we don't manufacture these the rail components in Nigeria, obviously. So which means that whenever there is any sort of thing that requires spares and repairs, we need the National Railway Corporation or wherever is going to have to do a special order to the South Africans or to the Indians, and then wait for any such a time as they might see fit to attend to our order, because these things are simply not made anywhere else in the world. Now everyone else has moved on. The Germans have moved on, the Chinese have moved on, the Japanese, the Americans, everybody, the Italians, nobody uses narrow gauge rail anymore, apart from those two places that I mentioned. So what that means is that in addition to the Niger Delta and the Southeast being deliberately excluded from future economic opportunities created by standard gauge rail elsewhere in the country, and the inability to interoperate with those ones, it's also going to be the case that even the narrow gauge rail line will inevitably fall into disrepair and become inoperable. So in other words, the Southeast and the Niger Delta will not have rail infrastructure going forward if this project is allowed to continue. So I'm sure you are seeing the reasons why I said I'm happy that this project was actually stopped. And then my third and final reason why I believe this project has no business going forward, and I'm very happy that it has been stopped, is that the loans that have been taken out to fund these projects, whether standard gauge or narrow gauge rail across Nigeria, are loans which are going to be repaid using money which is generated in the South. The Southwest, the Southeast, and the Niger Delta. Again, argue with the numbers, don't argue with me, right? Argue with the statistics, because numbers don't tell lies, right? That's where the money is coming from. So if you're going to deliberately exclude an entire quarter of Nigeria from future economic opportunities because of whatever political game you have going on, then it is absolutely, it's unfair, it's insulting, it's morally reprehensible to expect those same people to then pick up the tab for not just the expensive railway lines, standard gauge railway lines that other people are going to enjoy, including the ones that have no business case for them, such as the Kano to Maradi railway line, but they will also have to pay and finance their own economic destruction in terms of financing that narrow gauge rail line, which is going to become an albatross around their neck. It's going to fall into disrepair. It's going to be inoperable. It doesn't interoperate with the rest of the country, so it's going to be useless for interregional trade. And then there's a $3 billion tag attached to it, and who's going to pay off that $3 billion? It's those same people. So to Engineer Sambo, I'm very happy that you've for whatever reason, you probably didn't do it with good intentions in mind, obviously, but I'm very happy that you did it. And please, long may it continue. That project must be stopped until such a time as an economically literate government comes into power and makes the economically obvious decision to invest in standard gauge rail infrastructure in the places where the numbers state that it will be viable, profitable, and useful. Thank you. Moving on to our final story for the week. Nigerians under 40 are no longer permitted to visit the UAE. Now, some of you might recall a video that went viral on the internet some months ago, where Nigerians apparently from rival coal factories took their nonsense from Nigeria to spectacle. And UAE government has apparently taken the decision following these and other events to essentially ban what it considers to be the high risk of from getting into the country. Essentially, if you're Nigerian, you're under 40, you're not getting into the UAE, you're not getting into Dubai, basically. And by the way, it doesn't matter how much money you have or how well recognized you are. That's how it is. I recall this actually has been going on for a while. It actually happened to a very popular YouTuber you might know. His name is Tayo Aino. He's a good friend of mine as well. And apparently it has now been sort of semi-officially written into law in the UAE now that if you're under 40, you hold a green passport, you are single, you are not getting into the country. Now, there are three things that I'm going to say about this. And the first is regarding the UAE government itself. Now, regardless of whatever Nigerians have done, and Nigerians definitely have done things in the UAE, but regardless of whatever Nigerians have done or are doing, it is also the case that the UAE government has a reputation for taking actions which can only be classified as racist, right? And I'm saying this because I myself have been a victim of such actions. I remember the last time I visited Dubai for recreational purposes, sometime in 2020. I was a pretty well-known journalist, and I had bylines in CNN and whatnot at the time. I wasn't an unknown quantity, and I just happened to be flying in to spend a couple of weeks for a holiday. I had a return ticket, I had a hotel reservation. I was not a high-risk person in any way. And I remember I just cleared immigration and I got pulled aside. And then this guy insisted on going through my entire suitcase. There was no need for it, but he just insisted on doing it. And the only two people he did that to were the only two Nigerians on the flight. Right? We're basically the only two black people who were coming in on that flight, and we were randomly selected. So, and obviously this isn't just my personal experience. I have tons of friends and acquaintances who have all sorts of stories about their engagements with the authorities in the UAE and how the UAE authorities tend to sort of refuse to understand the nuances between African, Nigerian, black. Everything to them is just all one big humongous monolith, right? And I have a friend, for example, who his parents are from Uganda, but he's British. He was born and raised in London, and he worked in Dubai for a while. And it would often happen that whenever maybe there's a problem with some African community or whatever, the UAE police would come around and just start arresting black people randomly, and he would get arrested. And then because they wouldn't even listen to him when he's trying to explain to them that I'm not an African passport holder. They just go to the police station first, and then when he gets to the police station, then he produces his red passport, because he used to walk everywhere with his British passport because of issues like this. And then they would let him go because he has a UK passport. But the other people, be they Nigerians or Ghanaians, Cameroonians, they just get deported. Apparently that was just standard operating procedure as far back as 2015, 2016 in the UAE. And now they're taking it a step further. And it should be noted again that regardless of what Nigerians have done, these actions under international law technically are illegal. Obviously, nobody's going to enforce it. Who's going to look the government of one of the most powerful, one of the wealthiest countries in the world in the eye and tell them you shouldn't be doing this? No one's going to do it, and it's fine. But for the record, it has to be stated that regardless of what a particular subset of Nigerians have done or are doing, and it is a subset of Nigerians. It is not Nigerians as a monolith. It's a subset of Nigerians, right? I am Nigerian too, right? Tayo I know is Nigerian. There are thousands of Nigerians who have lived and worked in Dubai for years, for decades even, without incident, right? It is unfair. It is racist. It is intellectually reductive and backward to sort of tar everyone with one brush because of what one group of people have done, right? I get the impression that the UAE government doesn't really want to put in the work of understanding nuances and actually sort of coming up with a visa policy that deals with these things in significant depth, the way some other countries have done, right? And I kind of understand that as well, but for reference purposes, it must be stated that this is wrong, right? You shouldn't make an entire group of people suffer for what a subset of them have done. Now, having said that, there also needs to be something that must be said about the Nigerians who applied for a visa, presumably saved up money to buy a flight ticket, which is not cheap, got on a plane, flew how many kilometers away is it? 4,000, 5,000 kilometers away, or 3,000 kilometers away to a country on another continent, right? Presumably to start a new life, and then got there and then brought the same nonsense which they were presumably trying to run away from in Nigeria with them to a new place, to a new set of people who are not used to dealing with this kind of thing at all. Because remember, the UAE is an extremely low crime country. It's an extremely low crime environment. There are certain types and frequencies of the antisocial behavior and criminal behavior that they are simply not used to, in fairness to them. It is unthinkable that you would leave your home and export that sort of egregious nonsense to another continent and do so openly and in a way that gets all of us sort of tarred with this brush. Now, even if you don't care what the impact that your actions are having on other people who happen to share the same color of passport as you should bear in mind that the UAE is really not the country to pull that kind of stunting. The UAE is not a democracy. It's always easy to forget. It's a well-developed country. It's a relatively welcoming country. It appears to be a relatively open society, but it's not a democracy. It's a constitutional monarchy. People still get whacked. People still get disappeared. It is that kind of place, right? And the strength of your passport is inversely proportional to the likelihood of those kinds of things happening to you. So if you hold a weak passport, like we do, whether we like it or not, the UAE is really not the place to be doing that kind of stuff. So even if you don't care about what impact your actions have on other people who share the same color of passport as you do, you should bear in mind that you're potentially putting yourself in a very dangerous situation. Right? Those guys do not play. And then the final thing I'm going to say on this topic is with regard to the Foreign Affairs Ministry, Nigerian Foreign Affairs Ministry, and the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission. Now, whenever this sort of issue comes up, Nigerians either misbehaving abroad or getting into trouble, whether fairly or unfairly, whether they knew anything about it or whether it was just an unfortunate sequence of events, as was the case in Itunu Babalola's case. There is always, or almost always, a certain someone who then emerges to essentially say, hey, this is what I'm always telling you people, that you people always go to these places to misbehave. Like, why can't you behave yourselves? Sort of talking down on Nigerians like a school teacher talking to like badly behaved children. And this person happens to be Nigeria's Diaspora Commission Chair, Erewa. The same lady who has apparently made me some kind of murder suspect in her imaginary Abuja office investigation. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, this has to be said. Whether Nigerians have done something or have not done something, whether Nigerians are behaved well or have behaved terribly, whatever the case is, your job as a foreign-facing public servant is to defend the interests of Nigeria and Nigerians. That is your job, right? Your job is not to talk down on Nigerians or lecture Nigerians or tell Nigerians how all of this is their fault and how this is not, if that is what you want to do, you shouldn't be in that job. That's not what your job is. If you are in a job that entails the foreign affairs, that entails diplomacy, that entails interfacing with foreign governments and foreign entities on behalf of Nigeria and Nigerians, that implies that automatically whatever it is that Nigerians have done or are accused of doing, your default position is to defend their interests. That is it. So if you are better than Nigerians, or you feel that you are better than Nigerians and you have better things to do than defend the interests of the people whose taxes are paying your salaries and perks and whatever, then you shouldn't be in that office, right? And I'm not even talking about the other things you do in that office, such as accusing journalists of murder and ridiculous things like that. I'm talking about your basic job as a public servant, be it in the Foreign Affairs Ministry or in the Nigerians in the Diaspora Commission. I'm not sure you know what your job is. I'm not sure you understand that your job entails being on the side of Nigerians by default. That you don't get to stand on your high horse and talk down on the people who are paying you to be in office. I don't think you understand that, and it's very important that you do. And if you don't, it's very important that the next person coming in, whoever that person may be, it's only a few months away now, hopefully, that person should understand that in situations like this, the job of people in those positions is to interface with governments like that of the UAE and try to reach some sort of compromise or some sort of agreement, right? That the next person coming in understands that regardless of however bad Nigeria is not the worst place in the world. There are worse places than Nigeria, and those places have foreign-facing public servants who still defend the interests of those countries and those people, no matter how badly behaved they are anywhere in the world, right? So there's nothing special about Nigeria. There's nothing unthinkable about defending the interests of Nigeria if you are being paid to do that. So kindly do your job and stop chasing David Hundeyin around and accusing him of having a relationship with somebody who was in a prison in Bondoku, a city I've never been to. Thank you very much. And that was the first episode of The Actual News with David Hundeyin, the show where we discuss the stories that actually matter and nobody is safe. This was a lot of fun, and I hope this will become more of a thing going forward. Join me again next week for another edition of this show, and hopefully by that time, that story involving that person who is going to be heavily involved in that thing that we're all looking forward to next year, and nobody's talking about the story because everybody wants to pretend that it's not a story, even though it's the biggest story in the land. If you know the story I'm referring to, then it's probably that one. Yes, we'll discuss that story next week. See you next time.